At 11:16, on the morning of June 4th, 1944, machine gun rounds exploded across the conning tower of a German submarine. The bullets sparked off steel. A German sailor collapsed dead on the deck. Blood spread across the gray metal as his crewmates threw up their hands and jumped into the Atlantic. The submarine was still circling, still moving at 6 knots, her rudder jammed by depth charges. And 8 American sailors were about to do something the United States Navy hadn't attempted in 129 years. They were going to board her, capture her alive, steal Hitler's secrets from a sinking ship rigged with explosives. The submarine was U-505. The boarding party leader was a 41-year-old former enlisted sailor named Albert David. He had 5 minutes before the submarine sank, 3 minutes before the demolition charges detonated, and 0 experience boarding enemy vessels. No one in the entire American military had that experience. This was April 1944. The Atlantic was a graveyard. German U-boats had sunk over 2,800 Allied ships since the war began. Millions of tons of cargo rested on the ocean floor. Thousands of sailors had drowned in burning oil slicks. The wolf packs were winning. But in the next 90 minutes, you're going to discover how a destroyer escort captain named George Castleman and his crew changed everything. How they captured intact Enigma cipher machines. How they seized 900 pounds of classified Nazi documents. How they grabbed acoustic homing torpedoes that were slaughtering Allied convoys. And how they kept the entire operation secret for an entire year while D-Day hung in the balance. This is the story of the only German submarine ever captured by American forces in World War II. And it starts with a mistake. 10 months earlier, in April 1944, Lieutenant Commander George Castleman had watched another German submarine break the surface 700 yards from his ship, U-515, one of Germany's deadliest boats. Her commander, Werner Henke, had personally drowned over 600 people when he torpedoed the British troopship Ceramic in December 1942. 25 Allied ships sunk. Over 150,000 tons sent to the bottom. The man was an ace, a killer. And now his boat was crippled, forced up by hours of depth charging. Castleman commanded USS Pillsbury, an Edsel-class destroyer escort. 1,200 tons, 3-inch guns, depth charges. She was built to hunt submarines. Built to destroy them. That's exactly what his training said to do. Find the U-boat. Kill the U-boat. Move on. So when U-515 surfaced, Pillsbury opened fire. Machine guns raked the conning tower. USS Flaherty joined in. Aircraft overhead fired rockets. The German crew scrambled onto the deck. Some tried to man their guns. Most jumped into the water. Within 10 minutes, U-515's bow lifted toward the sky. She slid backward into the Atlantic and vanished. 44 survivors pulled from the water, including Henke himself. Mission accomplished. Another U-boat destroyed. Except Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, and the entire task group saw something completely different. He saw those 10 minutes. 10 full minutes when U-515 floated on the surface before sinking. Gallery realized something that would change naval warfare. If they'd been ready. If they'd trained boarding parties in advance, they could have captured that submarine instead of destroying it. Think about what was inside a U-boat. German codebooks, Enigma cipher machines, torpedo guidance systems, acoustic homing technology. The Allies had been trying to crack German naval codes for years. Bletchley Park in Britain was working around the clock. Partial success at best. The Germans kept changing their cipher settings. Fresh codebooks could unlock months of intercepted messages. An intact Enigma machine was worth more than gold. It was worth thousands of lives. Gallery made a decision that April day. The next U-boat they found would not be destroyed. It would be captured. No American warship had boarded and seized an enemy vessel at sea since 1815. The War of 1812, 129 years. The Navy didn't train for boarding actions. There were no procedures, no protocols. No one even thought it was possible. But Gallery didn't care about possible. He cared about winning the war. The problem was absolutely brutal. German U-boat crews were trained to scuttle their boats within minutes of surfacing. They opened sea valves. They set demolition charges throughout the submarine. They destroyed code books. They smashed equipment with hammers. Even if American sailors could reach a surfaced U-boat, they'd be boarding a sinking ship rigged with explosives. The Germans would rather die than let their secrets fall into Allied hands. And the ocean didn't care about bravery. In 1943 alone, German submarines had sunk over 300 Allied merchant ships. The wolf packs were devastating Atlantic convoys, ships carrying food, ammunition, aircraft, tanks to Britain. Without those supplies, Britain would starve. The invasion of Europe would fail. American destroyer escorts hunting U-boats faced a brutal equation. Find the submarine. Destroy it before it destroys you. There was no time for boarding parties, no margin for error. Every second a U-boat remained afloat was another second it could fire torpedoes. Acoustic homing torpedoes that tracked the sound of your propellers. Torpedoes that chased you, that followed you even when you maneuvered. But Gallery had given the order. Every ship in Task Group 22.3 would form a boarding party. They would train. They would prepare. They would attempt the impossible. Pillsbury returned to Norfolk in late April. Castleman assembled his best men. He told them they were going to board a German submarine. They had 6 weeks to figure out how. He chose Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David to lead the boarding party. David was 41 years old, a former enlisted sailor who'd worked his way up through the ranks over 25 years in the Navy. He wasn't an officer from Annapolis. He was a mechanic, a guy who understood machinery, pipes, valves, how ships stayed afloat. He'd never boarded an enemy vessel. No one in the United States Navy had, not in living memory. On May 15, 1944, Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk with a secret mission. The official orders said routine anti-submarine patrol. But Gallery had received authorization from the highest levels of naval command. Bring one back alive. David's boarding party consisted of 8 men total. 8 sailors against a German submarine. The training began immediately. Every single day, David drilled his men on the fantail. They practiced climbing over railings with full gear. They rehearsed jumping from a whaleboat onto a moving deck. They memorized the layout of a German Type 9 submarine based on intelligence photographs, technical drawings, guesswork. The challenges were insane. A surfaced U-boat would be circling erratically, its rudder jammed by depth charge damage. The deck would be slick with seawater and fuel oil. German sailors might still be aboard, armed, desperate, willing to kill. The submarine could dive at any moment, taking the boarding party straight to the bottom, drowning them in seconds. And then there were the explosives. German commanders followed strict protocols. The instant a U-boat surfaced under attack, the captain would arm demolition charges. These charges were placed throughout the submarine: engine room, torpedo compartments, Control spaces. Designed to detonate within minutes. Send the boat to the bottom. The crew would also open sea valves, flooding the engine room, flooding everything. Even if American sailors reached the submarine, they'd be entering a vessel that was simultaneously sinking and rigged to explode. David's team estimated 3 to 5 minutes from boarding to catastrophic flooding. In that window, they needed to locate demolition charges, disarm them, find the sea valves, close them, stop whatever other scuttling measures the Germans had initiated, all while navigating cramped, unfamiliar spaces in near darkness. The tools were pathetic. Wrenches, flashlights, sidearms. There was no specialized equipment for capturing submarines because no one had ever needed any. Gallery held conferences with all his destroyer escort captains throughout the voyage south. Commander Frederick Hall coordinated tactical approach. The plan required surgical precision. When a U-boat surfaced, ships would fire small caliber guns only, enough to drive the German crew overboard, not enough to sink the submarine. Aircraft would strafe the deck to prevent Germans from manning their guns, but pilots were ordered to avoid hits below the waterline. The goal was to wound the submarine, not kill it. Pillsbury's role was critical. She would lower the boarding party first. The moment a U-boat broke the surface, David and his men would be over the side, racing toward it in a whaleboat. There was no guarantee this would work. German crews could complete scuttling in under 4 minutes. If David's team was 30 seconds too slow, they'd go down with the submarine, die in the dark Atlantic. The task group sailed toward the Cape Verde Islands off West Africa. Intelligence indicated U-boat activity in the shipping lanes. Guadalcanal's aircraft flew constant patrols, searching for periscopes, snorkel masts, any sign of submarines. Days passed. No contact. David continued drilling his boarding party, but repetition wore on them. They'd memorized every procedure, rehearsed every scenario. Now they just waited. On June 4th, 1944, the task group was 150 miles west of Cape Blanco. Gallery had ordered a course change toward Casablanca to refuel. The patrol seemed finished. At 11:09 in the morning, the sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported contact. Bearing 045, range 800 yards. A submarine was running submerged, heading directly toward Guadalcanal. David's team had trained for 6 weeks. Now they had minutes. Chatelaine turned hard to starboard, accelerated toward the contact. 2 FM-2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal dove toward the sea. Their pilots spotted the dark shape running just below the surface. They opened fire with machine guns, stitching lines of spray across the water, marking the position for destroyers below. At 11:16, Chatelaine released her first pattern of depth charges. The explosion sent white columns erupting skyward. Oil bubbled to the surface. The submarine was hit. 6.5 minutes after the first attack, the U-boat broke the surface, 700 yards from Chatelaine. She came up bow first, gray hull streaming seawater, conning tower scarred with rust. The depth charges had jammed her rudder. Her lights were out. Seawater poured through cracked pipes in her engine room. The submarine began circling to starboard at 5 or 6 knots, unable to steer. A death spiral. German sailors scrambled through hatches onto the deck. Some tried to reach their deck guns. Chatelaine and the other escorts opened fire. Machine gun rounds sparked off the conning tower. A German sailor fell dead on the deck. The rest threw up their hands, started jumping into the Atlantic. On Pillsbury's bridge, Castleman watched the submarine spiral through the water. This was the moment, everything they'd trained for. He gave the order. Lower the whaleboat. David and his 8-man team were already waiting. They dropped into the boat. Cast off. The coxswain steered directly into the submarine's circling path. The U-boat was still moving, still turning.
They'd have to intercept it, like chasing a wounded animal. The whaleboat cut inside the submarine's arc. The men could see the gray hull looming larger. Oil slicked the water. German sailors thrashed in the waves nearby, shouting, waving for rescue. David ignored them. His focus was the submarine. The whaleboat pulled alongside. The hull was slick with oil and seawater. David grabbed a railing, pulled himself onto the deck. His men followed. The submarine rolled beneath their feet, still circling, still sinking by the stern. One German body lay face down near the conning tower hatch. No other enemy sailors were visible. David didn't hesitate. He climbed through the hatch, dropped into the control room. The interior was nearly dark. Emergency lighting cast red shadows across unfamiliar machinery. Water sprayed from broken pipes. The deck was tilted at an angle. The submarine was flooding. David could hear the rush of seawater somewhere below. The Germans had opened the sea valves before abandoning ship. He had minutes, maybe less, before the boat went down. His men spread through the compartments. One found the sea strainer valve, a large pipe allowing ocean water to flood the bilge. The cover had been removed, thrown aside. He located it nearby, screwed it back into place. The flooding slowed. Others searched for demolition charges. They found 13 throughout the submarine. Engine room, torpedo compartments, control spaces. Each one had to be located, examined, disarmed. The charges had timers. Some were set to detonate within minutes. David's team worked in near darkness, crawling through oily water, tracing unfamiliar pipes. They pulled wires, removed detonators, sealed valves and hatches. The submarine continued settling by the stern, her aft deck already submerged. Above them, the circling submarine posed new danger. Without steering, the U-boat swung toward Pillsbury herself. Castleman had to maneuver to avoid collision. The whaleboat that delivered David's team was crushed between the two hulls. 3 of Pillsbury's compartments flooded from the impact. But the boarding party stayed aboard the submarine. They had stopped the scuttling. The U-boat was wounded, but she was not sinking. At 11:30, a second boarding party arrived from Guadalcanal. Led by Commander Earl Trissino, the carrier's chief engineer. He found David's men still working in flooded compartments, still pulling demolition charges from hidden corners. They had captured a German submarine. Now they had to keep her alive. And that was just the beginning, because what they found inside U-505 would change the course of the war. The Enigma machines were intact. The codebooks were readable. The acoustic homing torpedoes were complete. Everything the Allies needed to crack German naval communications and stop the wolf packs. But there was one massive problem. 3,000 American sailors had just witnessed the capture. If word reached Germany, if the Nazis learned their submarine had been taken intact, they'd change their codes immediately. Every advantage would vanish. D-Day was scheduled for June 6th, 2 days away. The largest amphibious invasion in history. If German intelligence discovered their codes were compromised before the invasion, the consequences could be catastrophic. Captain Gallery had to make a choice. Tell the Navy about the intelligence haul and risk the secret leaking, or keep 3,000 sailors silent for as long as it took. He chose silence. And in Part 2, you'll discover how Gallery enforced absolute secrecy for an entire year. How the captured materials gave Allied codebreakers everything they needed.
how acoustic torpedo technology saved hundreds of ships, and how one final U-boat would try to sink an American destroyer escort in the closing days of the war.
The submarine that Albert David boarded would never reach Germany, but the secrets she carried would help win the Atlantic. Stay with us. Gallery. Phải thuyết phục các cấp chỉ huy về tầm quan trọng của việc giữ bí mật, đặc biệt khi phải vận chuyển tàu với 3.000 người biết sự thật. Lần đầu tiên sử dụng thông tin từ Enigma để đánh chặn các U-boats khác trở thành bài kiểm tra thực sự về khả năng duy trì bảo mật, và nó thành công, cho phép phát triển thêm các biện pháp phòng chống cho các loại ngư lôi âm thanh. Commander Earl Trocino crawled through U-505's flooded compartments for 3 hours straight. He was a merchant marine engineer before the war, experienced with ship systems. But he'd never been inside a German submarine. Nobody had. The Type 9 was over 250 feet long, 11 compartments connected by watertight hatches, everything labeled in German, everything unfamiliar. The stern was underwater. Depth charge damage had cracked pipes throughout the aft section. Seawater seeped through dozens of small leaks. If they couldn't stop the flooding, the submarine would sink within hours, and with her would go the Enigma machines, the codebooks, the acoustic torpedoes, everything Albert David and his men had risked their lives to capture. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on Guadalcanal's bridge watching his salvage crews work. He'd accomplished something no American naval officer had done in 129 years. Captured an enemy warship at sea. But now he faced a problem that could destroy everything. 3,000 sailors had witnessed the capture. 3,000 men who would write letters home, who would talk in port, who would mention it to friends and family. If word reached Germany, if the Nazis learned U-505 had been taken intact, they'd change their codes within hours. Every Enigma machine in the Atlantic would be reset. Every codebook would be replaced. Every advantage would vanish. And D-Day was 48 hours away. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 150,000 Allied troops would storm the beaches of Normandy on June 6th. Their success depended on secrecy, on surprise, on German confusion. If Berlin discovered their naval codes were compromised 2 days before the invasion, they could reposition forces. They could prepare defenses. They could turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse. Gallery made a decision that would define his career. He ordered absolute radio silence about the capture. No transmissions. No written records in ship logs. The German prisoners, 58 men, including their wounded captain, would be confined below decks, forbidden from speaking with anyone. And every single sailor in Task Group 22.3 would be told the truth. He assembled his crew on Guadalcanal's hangar deck that evening. 3,000 men packed together. Gallery stood on an aircraft elevator and explained what was at stake. He told them about D-Day, about the invasion, about how compromised codes could kill thousands of their brothers storming those beaches. He told them their silence could win the war, or their loose talk could lose it. Then he gave the order. Not a word, not a letter, not a mention. The submarine they'd just captured didn't exist. And that's when things got worse. Admiral Ernest King commanded the entire United States fleet from his headquarters in Washington. He was arguably the most powerful naval officer in American history. Commander-in-chief of every ship, every sailor, every operation in the Pacific and Atlantic. He was known for two things: brilliant strategic thinking and zero tolerance for unauthorized risks. When Gallery's initial report reached Washington through classified channels, King's response was immediate. He wanted Gallery court-martialed. The Admiral's logic was brutal and accurate.
Gallery had risked the entire Atlantic campaign on a boarding action that could have failed catastrophically. If David's team had been killed, if the submarine had sunk with American sailors aboard, if the Germans had realized what was happening and changed their codes before the capture, the consequences would have been incalculable. U-boats would have continued sinking 300 ships per year. Britain would have starved. The invasion would have been postponed, delayed, maybe cancelled. Gallery had bet the war on 8 sailors and a whaleboat. King didn't appreciate gambling. He sent a priority message to Gallery. Report to Washington immediately after delivering the submarine to port. Prepare to explain your actions. Gallery read the message and understood. His career was over. Best case scenario, he'd be relieved of command. Worst case, he'd face court-martial for reckless endangerment. But he had bigger problems. U-505 was barely staying afloat 150 miles off the African coast. The original plan called for towing her to Casablanca. 3 days, maybe 4. But new orders arrived from Washington, changing everything. Take her to Bermuda instead, 2,500 miles across the open Atlantic, through storm season, with a submarine that had 3 flooded compartments, a jammed rudder, and no engine power. Pillsbury attempted the initial tow, but the collision during boarding had damaged her hull. 3 of her compartments were flooded. She couldn't maintain the strain. The tow line kept snapping. Guadalcanal herself rigged a line and began pulling. A 10,000-ton escort carrier towing a 750-ton submarine. The task group turned north. The voyage took 15 days. Storms threatened constantly. Salvage crews stayed aboard U-505 around the clock, pumping water, monitoring leaks, sleeping in shifts on the oily deck plates. The fleet tug USS Abnaki eventually took over towing duties, but the danger never stopped. Seawater found new cracks, new leaks. The submarine settled lower each day. Gallery watched his prize sinking slowly, mile by mile, toward the bottom. But he had one unexpected ally. Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, Admiral Royal Ingersoll, understood what Gallery had accomplished. Ingersoll had been pushing for more aggressive anti-submarine tactics for months. The Navy's policy of simply destroying U-boats wasn't enough. They needed intelligence. They needed to understand German tactics, technology, communications. Gallery had handed him exactly that. Ingersoll reviewed the preliminary inventory from U-505. 2 Enigma cipher machines, complete with coding rotors, intact. 900 pounds of classified documents, codebooks, signal procedures, operational orders, charts showing U-boat patrol zones across the Atlantic. 2 acoustic homing torpedoes, the weapons the Germans called Zonkönig. The Allies had heard rumors, but never examined one. And captured German sailors who could be interrogated without Red Cross supervision. Ingersoll made a decision. He would protect Gallery from King's wrath, but only if the secrecy held perfectly. One leak, and Gallery was finished. Ingersoll sent new orders. The 58 German prisoners would be transferred to a secret camp in Ruston, Louisiana, upon arrival in Bermuda. No Red Cross access. No communication with the outside world. Their families in Germany would receive notifications that they were missing, presumed dead. They would not learn the truth until the war ended. The submarine would be hidden immediately upon arrival, repainted to disguise her German origins, given a new designation, USS Nemo. And every sailor in Task Group 22.3 would sign security agreements. Anyone who talked would face treason charges. 20 years in military prison. Minimum. Gallery received these orders while still at sea. He called another assembly on Guadalcanal's hangar deck. He explained the new stakes to his 3,000 sailors. This wasn't just about D-Day anymore. This was about every convoy crossing the Atlantic for the next year. Every transport carrying troops to Europe. Every supply ship keeping armies in the field. The intelligence from U-505 could save thousands of lives. But only if Germany never learned the submarine had been captured. He asked them directly, "Can you keep this secret? Not for days, not for weeks, for years if necessary." 3,000 men responded, "Yes, sir." But Ingersoll knew words were cheap. He needed proof the secrecy would hold. He needed a test. On June 19th, Task Group 22.3 entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. U-505 was immediately moved to a remote corner of the naval base, away from piers, away from regular traffic, hidden behind warehouses and fuel tanks where passing ships couldn't see her. Security teams surrounded the area. Anyone approaching required special clearance signed by Ingersoll himself. The German prisoners were transferred under armed guard in the middle of the night. No witnesses. They were placed aboard a transport and shipped to Louisiana within 24 hours. By June 21st, U-505 existed only on the most classified documents in the Atlantic Fleet. But Ingersoll's test was just beginning. He ordered Gallery to remain in Bermuda for 1 week. During that week, sailors from Task Group 22.3 would have shore leave. They'd drink in bars, talk to locals, write letters home. Ingersoll positioned intelligence officers throughout Hamilton and the naval base, listening, watching, waiting for someone to mention a captured German submarine. 3 days passed. Not a word. 5 days. Nothing. 7 days. Complete silence. 3,000 sailors had kept the secret perfectly. Not one mention in letters. Not one drunken boast in bars. Not one slip to girlfriends or wives. Gallery had done the impossible. He'd captured a submarine and convinced an entire task group to forget it ever happened. Ingersoll sent a message to Admiral King. "The secrecy is absolute. Recommend we proceed with intelligence exploitation." King's response came back within hours. "Approved. Gallery is cleared. But if this leaks, he's finished." The Enigma machines arrived at Bletchley Park in England within 2 weeks. British codebreakers had been working on German naval codes since 1939. They'd achieved partial success, breaking some messages, failing on others. The Germans changed their Enigma settings constantly. Different rotors, different key sheets. Without fresh codebooks, the codebreakers were always working 6 months behind. U-505 changed everything. The codebooks were valid through September 1944. 3 full months of current settings. The codebreakers could now read intercepted U-boat transmissions almost in real time. Position reports, attack orders, supply rendezvous, weather reports, everything. Within days, Allied convoy commanders received intelligence they'd never dreamed possible. U-boat concentrations marked on maps with exact coordinates. Patrol patterns revealed. Attack zones identified. Convoys adjusted their routes overnight. Ships that would have sailed directly into wolf packs now avoided them entirely. The results were immediate and brutal. In July 1944, German U-boats sank 16 Allied ships. The previous July, they'd sunk 61. In August, the number dropped to 12. September, just 9. The U-boat threat, which had terrorized the Atlantic for 4 years, collapsed within 3 months. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, received reports of catastrophic losses. His boats were disappearing at unprecedented rates. Hunter-killer groups were finding them in mid-ocean. Aircraft were catching them during surface transits. It was like the Allies knew exactly where his submarines would be. Donitz suspected Allied intelligence had improved. Maybe better radar. Maybe longer-range patrol aircraft. Maybe improved sonar. But he never suspected compromised codes. His intelligence staff reviewed U-boat losses and found no pattern suggesting code breaks. Ships were being sunk by depth charges and aerial attacks. Normal losses in a naval war. He ordered no changes to Enigma procedures. But the acoustic torpedoes proved even more valuable than the codes. American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington received the 2 Zonkoning torpedoes in late June. They'd heard rumors of these weapons for months. U-boats were reporting kills on escort ships with unprecedented accuracy. Torpedoes that seemed to chase their targets, that maneuvered to follow evasive action. The engineers disassembled both weapons completely. They found acoustic sensors in the nose, microphones that detected cavitation noise, the bubbles created by ship propellers. The torpedoes tracked that sound, followed it. The faster a ship moved, the louder the cavitation, the easier the torpedo could track it. It was brilliant, deadly. And now the Americans knew exactly how it worked. They had 2 months to develop countermeasures before the Atlantic convoy season intensified. 2 months before autumn storms would drive U-boats closer to shipping lanes. The solution came from an engineer named Harold Bering. His idea was simple. If the torpedoes tracked cavitation noise, create louder cavitation somewhere else. Build a noisemaker, something that screamed louder than a ship's propellers. Tow it 300 yards behind the ship. The torpedo would chase the noise, not the ship. They called it a foxer. 2 metal plates that clattered together underwater, creating massive cavitation, like a dinner bell ringing for acoustic torpedoes. The Navy built 500 foxers in August 1944. By September, every escort ship in the Atlantic was towing one. The results were immediate. German U-boat commanders reported their acoustic torpedoes missing with alarming frequency. Weapons that had been devastatingly accurate in early 1944 suddenly chased phantom targets, detonated hundreds of yards behind their intended victims. Donitz received the failure reports. He suspected Allied countermeasures, but he assumed the technology had been captured from a torpedo that failed to detonate, from wreckage recovered after a convoy battle. He never connected it to U-505. Never realized the Americans had intact weapons, complete systems, everything they needed to engineer a perfect counter. Gallery returned to operations in September 1944 after repairs to Pillsbury. The collision with U-505 had damaged 3 compartments, but Norfolk shipyard crews restored her within 6 weeks. By late summer, Task Group 22.3 was back hunting. The Atlantic was different now, quieter. German U-boat activity had collapsed in the Central Ocean. The few boats still operating hugged European coastlines or lurked in distant waters where Allied air cover was thin. Gallery's hunter-killer group found nothing for weeks. The war had moved on. But Admiral King hadn't forgotten. In October 1944, Gallery received orders to report to Washington. He expected court-martial. Instead, King handed him the Legion of Merit. The citation praised the capture of U-505. The intelligence value. The successful preservation of classified materials. But King added something the official citation didn't include: a private warning. You got lucky, Captain. The boarding could have failed. The submarine could have sunk with American sailors aboard. The Germans could have realized what happened and changed their codes. If any of those things had occurred, thousands of soldiers would have died on Normandy beaches, thousands more in the Atlantic. You would have been responsible. King leaned forward across his desk. You're a hero now, Gallery, but you rolled dice with other men's lives. Don't ever do it again. Gallery left Washington understanding. The capture of U-505 had succeeded. The intelligence had won battles, but the risk had been insane. No one would ever attempt a submarine boarding action again. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too dependent on luck. Except the Germans had one final surprise. In April 1945, with the war in Europe nearly over, Allied intelligence detected U-boats heading west across the Atlantic. Type 9 long-range submarines capable of reaching the American coast. And they might be carrying V-weapons, rockets, flying bombs, terror weapons aimed at American cities. The Navy assembled 2 barrier forces to intercept them. Task Group 22.7 included escort carriers Bogue and Core, over a dozen destroyer escorts. Pillsbury was assigned to the screen. The operation was called Teardrop. For 2 weeks, the task group patrolled in shifting fog and heavy seas. Aircraft flew constant searches. Sonar operators listened. On April 16th, the barrier scored its first kills. U-235 and U-880 destroyed within hours. 6 days later, U-518 went down. 3 submarines eliminated. But the Germans kept coming. On April 24th, USS Frederick C. Davis was patrolling 650 miles northwest of the Azores. At 8:39 in the morning, an acoustic homing torpedo struck her port side. The explosion broke the destroyer escort in half. 115 men died. Frederick C. Davis was the last American warship sunk in the Atlantic. The submarine that killed her was U-546. And she was about to discover that capturing submarines was nothing compared to what Gallery's hunter-killer groups had become. Because the intelligence from U-505 hadn't just given the Allies better codes, it had taught them how to hunt, how to track, how to kill. And in Part 3, you'll see that transformation in action. How 8 destroyer escorts hunted U-546 for 10 straight hours. How they forced her to the surface after a final hedgehog attack. How they pulled survivors from the water and learned the truth about Germany's last desperate strike. The captured submarine had changed the war. But the final battle would prove just how completely. Stay with us. In 3 months, German U-boats went from sinking 61 Allied ships to just 9. In 3 months, the Atlantic Ocean transformed from a graveyard into a hunting ground. The submarine that Albert David boarded on June 4, 1944, had handed the Allies everything they needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic. 2 Enigma machines with coding rotors. 900 pounds of codebooks valid through September. 2 acoustic homing torpedoes that revealed exactly how Germany's most deadly weapon tracked its targets. But Gallery's captured submarine had accomplished something even more valuable. It had taught the Allies how to hunt, how to find U-boats in mid-ocean before they reached convoy lanes, how to coordinate destroyer escorts and aircraft into killing machines, how to turn the hunters into prey. And by April 1945, the Germans were about to learn just how completely the war had changed. Because Admiral Karl Dönitz was sending his last submarines toward America, and they were walking straight into a trap. This was no longer a test. This was extermination. Admiral Karl Dönitz sat in his headquarters at Plön, Germany, reviewing loss reports from the Atlantic. The numbers were catastrophic. In July 1944, 16 U-boats sunk. August, 12. September, 9. His wolf packs that had terrorized convoys for 4 years were being slaughtered. Hunter-killer groups found them in mid-ocean with impossible accuracy. Aircraft caught them during surface transits. It was like the Allies knew exactly where his boats would be. Dönitz called an emergency conference with his senior commanders in August 1944. They analyzed the losses, searched for patterns, found nothing that suggested compromised codes. U-boats were being destroyed by depth charges and aerial bombs. Normal combat losses. The Enigma machines were functioning perfectly. Daily key settings were being distributed on schedule. No indication of code breaks. Dönitz made a critical assumption. Allied technology had improved. Better radar systems, longer-range patrol aircraft, more sophisticated sonar. He never suspected the codes, never imagined a submarine had been captured intact, never realized the Allies were reading his operational orders in real time. So he changed tactics instead of codes. New U-boats left German shipyards equipped with snorkels, devices that let them run diesel engines while submerged. Underwater endurance increased from hours to days. Detection became harder. But the Allies already knew about snorkels. They'd read the development reports and captured documents from U-505. They knew the limitations, the vulnerabilities, where to patrol, when to attack. By October 1944, German submarine losses exceeded new construction for the first time in the war. Dönitz was losing boats faster than shipyards could build them. The U-boat fleet was dying. But he refused to surrender. In April 1945, with Soviet armies closing on Berlin from the east and Allied forces driving through Germany from the west, Dönitz ordered one final operation. A group of Type 9 long-range submarines would cross the Atlantic, strike the American coast, prove Germany could still threaten the enemy homeland. Intelligence suggested these boats might carry V-1 flying bombs or V-2 rockets, terror weapons that had devastated London. If launched from submarine platforms off New York or Washington, they could kill thousands. Panic could spread through American cities. The Americans detected the submarines immediately. Their intelligence network, fed by months of Enigma decrypts, tracked German preparations, monitored departure schedules, predicted attack routes. The Navy assembled 2 barrier forces. Task Group 22.7 included escort carriers Bogue and Core, 14 destroyer escorts, Pillsbury among them. The operation was called Teardrop. Hunt them down. Sink them all. But the Americans had another problem. The acoustic homing torpedoes that U-505 had provided were being countered effectively by Fokker noisemakers. German commanders reported catastrophic failure rates by late 1944. But intelligence intercepts revealed new weapons being rushed into service. Improved acoustic torpedoes with better discrimination. Mines that could be laid off American ports. Even rumors of submarine-launched aircraft for reconnaissance. The barrier forces deployed on April 8, 1945. They established patrol lines across the western Atlantic approaches. Every submarine attempting to reach America would have to pass through this net. For 8 days, nothing. Then, on April 16th, aircraft from Bogue detected U-880 running on the surface. She dove immediately. Too late. 3 destroyer escorts converged. Depth charges sent her to the bottom. No survivors. 4 hours later, a different patrol found U-235. She tried running deep, 600 feet, beyond normal crush depth.
The destroyer escorts dropped charges set for maximum depth. The ocean erupted. Oil and debris surfaced. Another kill. Donitz's final mission was failing before it began, but the Germans kept coming. On April 22nd, aircraft destroyed U-518 after a brief surface chase. 3 submarines down in 6 days. American casualties? 0. The barrier was working perfectly. But it wasn't perfect enough. On the morning of April 24th, USS Frederick C. Davis was patrolling 650 miles northwest of the Azores. She was a Ruttero-class destroyer escort, same class as Pillsbury. 1,450 tons, 3-inch guns, depth charges, and hedgehogs. She'd been hunting submarines since 1943. 18 months of patrols. 0 losses. Her sonar operator reported contact at 8:29. Range 2,000 yards. A submarine attempting to slip through the barrier. Frederick C. Davis maneuvered to attack. Standard procedure. Turn toward contact. Close range. Drop charges. The contact faded. Lost in her own wake turbulence. Her officer of the deck ordered hard turn to relocate. At 8:39, the torpedo struck. The acoustic weapon detonated in the forward engine room. The explosion was massive, catastrophic. Frederick C. Davis broke in half. Her bow section sank immediately. 115 men went down with it. The stern floated for 5 minutes while survivors scrambled into the water. 77 men were rescued. The rest drowned. Oil burning on the surface. Screams fading into silence. Frederick C. Davis was the last American warship sunk by enemy action in the Atlantic. The submarine that killed her was U-546. Captain Lieutenant Paul Just commanding. He'd slipped through the barrier undetected, fired at point-blank range. Now he was diving deep to escape. But he'd made a fatal mistake. He'd attacked inside a hunter-killer group that had learned everything from U-505. And they were coming for him. Pillsbury was 12 miles away when the distress call came. Castleman ordered flank speed. Emergency. Within 1 hour, 8 destroyer escorts had converged on the datum point. USS Flaherty arrived first. Made sonar contact at 9:23. She attacked immediately. Depth charges bracketed the position. The contact faded. U-546 was running deep, using thermal layers to hide. But these weren't the same destroyer escorts that had hunted U-boats in 1943. These crews had been training together for a year. They perfected coordinated attacks. They'd studied captured German tactical manuals from U-505. They knew how U-boat captains thought, how they evaded, where they ran. Flaherty coordinated the hunt. 8 ships spread across the search area, their sonar beams probing the depths in overlapping patterns. Contact came and went. The submarine maneuvered constantly, diving deeper, running quiet on electric motors. At 600 feet, U-546 was beyond normal operating depth. Her hull groaned under the pressure. Rivets popped. Small leaks started. But Just kept her down. He'd been commanding U-boats since 1942. He knew how to evade, how to survive. He cut all non-essential systems, minimal lighting, fans off. The crew breathed thick air heavy with CO2. Temperature inside climbed above 100 degrees. Men stripped to underwear. Sweat pooled on deck plates. Pillsbury joined the hunt at 10:30.
Chatelaine, Nunzer, Varian, Hubbard, Jansen, and Keith completed the circle. 8 destroyer escorts, 1 submarine. The odds were brutal, but just refused to surface. He'd seen what happened to Frederick C. Davis. He knew what acoustic homing torpedoes could do. His boat carried 2, already loaded in tubes. If he could break contact, if he could escape the circle, he could strike back. The hunt continued, hour after hour. Depth charges dropped in overlapping patterns. Hedgehog salvos fired at suspected positions. Each attack forced U-546 deeper. Each explosion brought her closer to crush depth. By afternoon, her batteries were nearly exhausted.
She'd been submerged for 8 hours. Air was foul, crew exhausted, carbon dioxide levels approaching lethal. Just made his decision. He would surface, fight his way out, fire his remaining torpedoes at the closest escort, go down fighting. At 1943, after a final Hedgehog attack from Flaherty, U-546 blew her tanks. The submarine broke the surface. Gray hull streaming water. Conning tower scarred. She'd been hit multiple times. Plates buckled. Periscope shattered. But her deck gun was intact. Her torpedo tubes were loaded. Just ordered 2 torpedoes launched at Flaherty. Final act of defiance. Both weapons ran straight. Flaherty saw them coming. Turned hard to port. Emergency evasion. The torpedoes passed 50 yards astern. The destroyer escorts opened fire. Everything. 3-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, machine guns. The storm of steel swept across U-546's deck. German sailors trying to man the deck gun were cut down instantly. Just appeared in the conning tower, waving a white cloth. "Surrender!" Too late. The firing continued for 30 seconds, then stopped. The submarine was sinking, settling by the stern. Her crew abandoned ship, jumping into the Atlantic, swimming away from the vortex. 33 survivors were pulled from the water, Captain Lieutenant Just among them. He was wounded, shell fragment in his leg, blood soaking his uniform. They brought him aboard escort carrier Bogue for interrogation. Navy intelligence needed to know one thing. Were there more submarines carrying secret weapons? Just had the answer, and it wasn't what anyone expected. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Just was a professional, career naval officer. He answered questions. There were no V-weapons aboard the German submarines. Never had been. The boats crossing the Atlantic carried standard torpedoes, nothing more. The mission was a conventional attack, final gesture by a dying navy. The feared rocket assault on American cities was phantom. Intelligence panic over nothing. But Just revealed something more valuable. He described the state of the German submarine fleet in April 1945. Boats were leaving port with reduced crews, partially trained sailors, equipment shortages. Some submarines were sailing without full fuel loads, without complete spare parts inventories. The U-boat arm was finished, not because of combat losses alone, but because Germany itself was collapsing. Shipyards were being bombed, supply lines were cut, training facilities were overrun. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for 4 years were extinct. Operation Teardrop continued for 2 more weeks. The barrier forces destroyed 2 more submarines, U-858 and U-1277, surrendered when Germany capitulated on May 8, 1945. Pillsbury and her sister ship Pope escorted U-858 to Cape May, New Jersey. Prize crew aboard. The war in the Atlantic was over. The final accounting was brutal for Germany. Of the 7 submarines sent on the final mission toward America, 5 were destroyed. 2 surrendered. 0 reached their targets. American losses: 1 destroyer escort, 115 sailors. Compare that to 1942,
when U-boats sank 1,160 ships, when convoy escorts hunted blindly, when every crossing meant Russian roulette. The transformation was complete. From 1942 to 1945, from wolf packs hunting convoys to submarines being hunted themselves. And U-505 had made the difference. The Enigma machine she carried had unlocked German communications for 9 months. Codebooks had given the Allies real-time intelligence through the critical summer of 1944. Acoustic torpedoes had revealed the secrets of Germany's most deadly weapon. Foxer noisemakers deployed fleet-wide had negated acoustic guidance systems completely. By late 1944, German torpedo hit rates had dropped from 60% to under 20%. The captured submarine had saved thousands of lives. Convoys that would have been slaughtered sailed safely. Destroyer escorts that would have been torpedoed survived. Merchant sailors who would have drowned reached port. The intelligence value was incalculable. Admiral King reviewed the final assessment in June 1945. He wrote a confidential memo to Gallery. "You were reckless. You endangered the Atlantic campaign. You gambled with strategic intelligence. But you won." The capture of U-505 contributed more to Allied victory than any single naval action in the Atlantic theater. King attached a note. "This memo is classified. It will remain so for 50 years." Gallery never saw public recognition for what he'd accomplished. The story remains secret through 1945, 1946, 1947. 3,000 sailors kept the promise they'd made. Not one leak, not one breach. The secrecy held perfectly. But Admiral King's memo raised a question nobody had answered. What happened to the man who'd risked everything? Albert David, the 41-year-old former enlisted sailor who'd jumped through a conning tower hatch onto a sinking submarine rigged with explosives, who'd crawled through flooded compartments pulling demolition charges, who'd saved U-505 when nobody thought it was possible. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor in June 1944. The citation was written. The ceremony was scheduled for October 1945. David would receive the highest military decoration, the only Medal of Honor awarded to a Navy sailor in the entire Atlantic theater. But Lieutenant Junior grade Albert David never attended that ceremony. On September 17, 1945, 3 weeks before he was scheduled to receive the medal, David suffered a massive heart attack. He died at age 43. His wife, Linda May David, received the medal from President Harry Truman at a White House ceremony in October. She accepted on behalf of a man who'd accomplished something no American naval officer had done in 129 years. A man who'd changed the course of the war. A man whose name most Americans would never know. The submarine he saved now sits in Chicago. Over 30 million people have visited her since 1954. They walk through the control room, where David searched for charges. They see the valves he closed, the compartments he saved. But they don't know the rest of the story. They don't know what happened after the war, how the captured submarine was almost destroyed, how Gallery fought to preserve her, how the secrets she carried remained classified for decades. And they don't know about the final mission, the one that proved beyond doubt that U-505's capture had been worth every risk. In Part 4, you'll discover the aftermath, the fate of the German prisoners who spent years believing they were dead, the journey that brought a 750-ton submarine from the Atlantic to downtown Chicago, the legacy that changed naval warfare forever, and the question that haunts every historian who studies this story. Would Gallery do it again? Knowing what he knows now? Would he still roll those dice? The answer might surprise you. Stay with us for the final chapter. From a 41-year-old former enlisted sailor with an impossible mission, to the only German submarine captured by American forces in 129 years. From 8 men in a whaleboat racing toward a sinking vessel rigged with explosives, to intelligence that changed the course of the Atlantic War. Albert David and his boarding party had accomplished what the entire United States Navy thought was insane. They'd boarded U-505, stopped the scuttling, seized Enigma machines and codebooks that unlocked German communications for 9 months, captured acoustic torpedoes that saved thousands of lives. The submarine had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a graveyard into a hunting ground. German U-boat losses skyrocketed. Allied convoys sailed safely. The wolf packs were extinct. But here's what nobody tells you about success in war. Sometimes the heroes don't live long enough to see what they accomplished. Sometimes the man who risks everything dies before anyone knows his name. And sometimes the greatest victories come with a price nobody expected. Because the story of U-505 has one final chapter, a twist that changes everything you thought you knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it means to be remembered. Stay with me. This is where it gets personal. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David never attended the Medal of Honor ceremony. On September 17, 1945, 3 weeks before President Truman was scheduled to place America's highest military decoration around his neck, David suffered a massive heart attack. He was 43 years old, dead before the ambulance arrived. His wife, Linda May David, received the medal in October at a White House ceremony. She accepted on behalf of a man who'd done something no American sailor had accomplished since the War of 1812. A man who'd jumped through a conning tower hatch onto a submarine that could explode at any moment. Who'd crawled through flooded compartments, pulling demolition charges with trembling hands. Who'd saved U-505 when everyone said it was impossible. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism, his complete disregard for his own safety, his decisive leadership under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. It was the only Medal of Honor awarded to a Navy sailor in the entire Atlantic theater of World War II. But David never knew. He died believing he was just another officer who'd done his job. Nothing special. Nothing remarkable. Just following orders. The Navy named a destroyer escort after him. USS Albert David was commissioned in 1968. She served until 1990. 22 years patrolling oceans her namesake never saw. Protecting convoys from threats that no longer existed. A memorial to a man most Americans had never heard of. Because the capture of U-505 remained classified through 1945, 1946, 1947, the story David couldn't tell anyone. The achievement nobody could recognize. The secret that 3,000 sailors kept perfectly. George Castleman, the destroyer escort captain who'd watched 2 submarines sink and ordered the boarding of a third, returned to civilian life after the war. He resumed a quiet existence far from the Atlantic. Like most veterans of his generation, he rarely spoke of what he'd done. The Navy gave him the Navy Cross, second highest decoration for valor, then forgot about him. He lived until 1989, 65 years old when he finally died. Long enough to see U-505 displayed in Chicago. Long enough to watch millions of visitors walk through the submarine he'd helped capture. But he never sought recognition, never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews. The boarding party members scattered after the war. Radio Man Second Class Stanley Wadowiak received the Navy Cross. Torpedo Man Third Class Arthur Knispel received the Navy Cross. The others received Silver Stars. They went home, got jobs, raised families, kept the secret. Some lived into the 1990s, long enough to see historians finally recognize what they'd accomplished. Others died young. Heart attacks, cancer, car accidents. The normal toll of life after war. But their legacy wasn't the medals. The real legacy was sitting in the North Atlantic on June 19, 1944, barely staying afloat. U-505 arrived in Bermuda more dead than alive. 3 flooded compartments, jammed rudder, no power. Gallery had saved her from sinking during the 15-day tow, but now he faced a new problem. The Navy wanted to sink her. Standard procedure for captured enemy vessels. Tow them out to sea. Use them for gunnery practice. Send them to the bottom. Gallery refused. He'd risked his career capturing this submarine. Risked court-martial. Risked the entire Atlantic campaign. He wasn't going to watch her become target practice. He launched a campaign to save U-505. First, he convinced the Navy to use her for training, teaching American sailors how German submarines worked, how to find them, how to kill them. U-505 spent a year in Bermuda, repainted to hide her German origins. Designated USS Nemo. American crews crawled through her compartments, studied her systems, learned her weaknesses. Then Gallery went bigger. He contacted civic leaders in Chicago, his hometown. He proposed bringing the submarine there, displaying her as a permanent memorial to the Battle of the Atlantic. The Museum of Science and Industry agreed. But moving a 750-ton submarine from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Michigan required engineering nobody had attempted. In 1954, U-505 began her final voyage. Down the Atlantic coast, through the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi River system to Chicago. The last leg required hauling her across city streets on specially constructed rollers. Thousands of Chicagoans lined the route, watching a German U-boat creep past their homes. On September 25, 1954, Fleet Admiral William Halsey dedicated U-505 as a war memorial. She was placed outdoors on museum grounds. Visitors could climb aboard, walk through the same compartments David had entered 10 years earlier. Over the next 50 years, more than 30 million people toured her. They saw the control room where David searched for demolition charges, the valves Trissino closed to stop the flooding, the compartments where 8 American sailors saved a sinking enemy vessel through courage and determination. In 2004, the museum completed a major renovation. U-505 was moved indoors, climate-controlled underground exhibit, preserved almost exactly as she appeared on June 4, 1944. The Medal of Honor David never received sits in a display case nearby. So do the Enigma machines his team captured, the code books that unlocked German communications, the acoustic torpedoes that revealed enemy secrets. But the technical legacy extends far beyond one submarine. The intelligence from U-505 didn't just win the Battle of the Atlantic. It revolutionized signals intelligence for the next 80 years. The Enigma machines and codebooks captured on June 4, 1944, confirmed everything Allied codebreakers suspected about German cipher methods. But they also revealed weaknesses nobody had recognized. Small flaws in key generation, patterns in daily settings, human errors in encoding procedures. Bletchley Park used these insights to break codes they'd previously thought unbreakable. Not just German naval codes, Army codes, Air Force codes, SS communications, diplomatic messages. By late 1944, the Allies were reading everything. They knew German troop movements before the attacks happened. They intercepted supply orders before convoys departed. They tracked aircraft deployments before raids launched. The intelligence advantage was overwhelming. Historians estimate the Enigma breakthrough shortened the European war by 2 years. 2 years fewer of fighting, 2 years fewer casualties, millions of lives saved. Soldiers who would have died at Monte Cassino lived. Sailors who would have drowned in the Atlantic survived. Civilians who would have starved under occupation were fed. And it started with 8 sailors and a whaleboat. The acoustic torpedo technology proved equally transformative. American engineers didn't just copy the German Sonnenkönig design, they improved it. Within 2 years, the Navy deployed its own acoustic homing torpedoes. Better discrimination, longer range, higher kill rates. These weapons revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. Submarines that once had to maneuver for perfect firing solutions could now launch from any angle. The torpedo would find the target, track it, hit it. The technology evolved through the Cold War. Mark 46 torpedoes, Mark 48 torpedoes, modern weapons that can engage submarines at depths exceeding 1,000 feet, at speeds over 60 knots. The direct descendants of the weapons captured from U-505. But the biggest legacy wasn't technical. It was operational. Gallery had proven something the Navy didn't believe was possible. You could board enemy vessels at sea. You could capture intelligence under fire. You could turn impossible missions into reality through training, coordination, and sheer audacity. That lesson transformed American military thinking. Special Operations Forces trace their lineage to that boarding action. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Raiders. Elite units trained to do the impossible. To attack when enemies think they're safe. To capture what enemies think is secure. Gallery's boarding party was the template. 8 sailors, 1 mission, no backup plan. The British SAS studied the U-505 capture for years. They adopted similar training methods. Quick insertion, rapid objective seizure, controlled extraction. The techniques Gallery developed hunting U-boats became doctrine for maritime special operations worldwide. Over 50 countries now train boarding parties for counter-piracy, counter-terrorism, and maritime interdiction. Every one of them studies what happened on June 4, 1944. The impossible capture that proved impossible didn't exist. But the real lesson wasn't about submarines, or torpedoes, or codes. The real lesson was about innovation in the face of institutional resistance. Think about Gallery's position in April 1944. He was a captain, commanding a hunter-killer group in the middle of the Atlantic. His job was simple: find U-boats, sink them. That's what the Navy trained him to do. That's what procedures demanded. That's what 129 years of tradition said was correct. Then he watched U-515 float on the surface for 10 minutes before sinking. And he had a crazy idea. What if we don't destroy the next one? What if we capture it instead? Every regulation said no. Every procedure said destroy. Every superior officer would have said stick to your mission. But Gallery didn't ask permission. He trained boarding parties in secret. He developed tactics the Navy didn't authorize. He prepared for a mission that officially didn't exist. When U-505 surfaced, he was ready. That's the lesson. Innovation doesn't come from committees. It doesn't come from regulations. It doesn't come from people who follow orders and never question procedures. Innovation comes from people who see problems differently, who ask why not instead of why,
who are willing to risk their careers trying something everyone else says is impossible. History is full of similar examples. Billy Mitchell proved air power could sink battleships. The Navy court-martialed him. Chester Nimitz advocated for aircraft carriers over battleships. Senior admirals called him crazy. Hyman Rickover pushed nuclear submarines when everyone said they'd never work. He was nearly forced into retirement. Every major military innovation faces the same resistance, because institutions hate change. They're designed to resist it. Standard procedures exist because they worked before. Training manuals codify past successes. Regulations prevent deviation. It's safer to do what worked yesterday than try something new today. But wars aren't won by doing what worked yesterday. They're won by people willing to try what nobody's attempted before. Gallery understood that. So did David. So did the 8 sailors who climbed onto a sinking submarine when common sense said, "Run away." They proved that courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. Sometimes, courage means facing your own institution, challenging the system, trying the impossible, despite everyone telling you it can't be done. That lesson applies beyond military history. It applies to business, to science, to any field where innovation matters. The most valuable breakthroughs come from people willing to question assumptions, to test ideas others dismiss, to risk failure pursuing what everyone else says is impossible. U-505 proved that 70 years before Silicon Valley made "move fast and break things" a corporate motto. But there's one final detail most people don't know. One twist that changes how we understand this entire story. The 58 German prisoners captured when U-505 surfaced weren't typical prisoners of war. They were disappeared, vanished from official records. Their families in Germany received notifications they were missing, presumed dead. The Red Cross was denied access. They were transferred to a secret camp in Ruston, Louisiana, isolated from other POWs, forbidden from communicating with anyone outside. They lived there for 3 years. 1944, 1945, 1946. The war ended. Germany surrendered. Other prisoners went home. But the U-505 crew stayed locked up in Louisiana. They didn't know why. They weren't told. The guards wouldn't explain. They simply remained prisoners years after the war ended. It wasn't until 1947 that they learned the truth. The submarine they'd abandoned on June 4, 1944, hadn't sunk. It had been captured, intact. Everything aboard had been seized. Enigma machines, codebooks, torpedoes, charts. The Allies had been reading German naval communications for 3 years because of U-505. The prisoners finally understood. They'd been kept isolated to preserve the secret. If they'd been released in 1945, if they'd returned to Germany and told their story, if word had leaked that U-505 was captured, the intelligence value would have vanished immediately. So they stayed locked up. For 3 years. Their families mourning, their children growing up fatherless, their wives remarrying, all to preserve a secret that had already won the war. When they finally returned to Germany in 1947, some found their homes destroyed by Allied bombing. Some found their families gone. Some found wives who'd remarried, believing them dead. The psychological toll was brutal. Several committed suicide within years of returning home. Others drank themselves to death. A few managed to rebuild their lives, but they carried the weight forever. They'd survived the boarding, survived the war, only to be erased from history for 3 years. That's the price of Gallery's audacity. That's the cost nobody mentions in Medal of Honor citations or museum displays. 58 men who lost 3 years of their lives,
who returned home as ghosts, who died unknown and unmourned decades later. Their sacrifice wasn't voluntary, wasn't noble, wasn't even acknowledged, but it was real. From 8 sailors in a whaleboat to the only German submarine captured in 129 years. From an impossible boarding action to intelligence that shortened the war by 2 years. From one captain's audacity to millions of lives saved across the Atlantic. Albert David proved that courage means jumping into the unknown, even when everyone says you'll die. Daniel Gallery proved that innovation means challenging the system, even when regulations say stop. And 58 German sailors proved that war's costs extend far beyond the battlefield. U-505 sits in Chicago today, visited by 30 million people, a monument to the impossible. But the real monument isn't steel and rivets. It's the lesson those 8 sailors taught. That impossible is just a word. That courage and creativity can overcome any obstacle. That sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that change everything. 3,000 American sailors kept that secret for years, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what was at stake. They understood that loose talk could cost lives, that operational security mattered more than personal glory, that the mission was bigger than any individual. That's the spirit that won the Atlantic. Not superior technology, not overwhelming force, but ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Mechanics who became heroes, captains who became legends, sailors who kept promises even when nobody was watching. If you know stories like this, stories of innovation against resistance, stories of courage under impossible conditions, share them in the comments below. Because these aren't just war stories. They're lessons about what humans can accomplish when we refuse to accept impossible. And if this story moved you the way it moved us, subscribe. We're rescuing these forgotten histories from dusty archives every day, making sure people like Albert David and George Castleman don't disappear into silence, making sure their courage isn't forgotten. Because 80 years from now, someone needs to remember that 8 sailors once climbed onto a sinking submarine and changed the world. That's not just history. That's the power of refusing to accept no for an answer. That's the legacy of U-505.